Hello everyone, I'm really glad you're here. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, settle in, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Green Truck in the Woods. It was early fall of 2011, and I was 21 years old when this strange and unforgettable event happened to me. I had just purchased a new set of night vision goggles and couldn't wait to test them out. There was a rugged, secluded area where I normally hunted with my family. Rough terrain with no trail maintenance, no rangers, and almost never another soul. The trailhead was about 45 minutes from the nearest town, but reaching the spot where I liked to hunt took another 4 to 5 hours of steady hiking. That day I arrived around 5 p.m, just early enough to get a head start on the hike before night fell. What struck me as odd immediately was the presence of a beaten-up green pickup truck, parked crookedly near the trail entrance. I'd never once seen another person here in 10 years of visiting this area. Shrugging it off, I tightened my gear and set out on the trail with the softening daylight at my back. About an hour into the hike, the trees closed in tighter, forming a narrow corridor. But ahead, maybe 50 yards away, there was a clearing, and in the middle of it stood a massive cottonwood tree, isolated and commanding. As I moved closer, I heard a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a deep, desperate, gut-wrenching wail. It was the sound of someone in immense pain, not physical pain, but something far worse, something emotional, raw and broken. I broke into a jog, wondering if someone had been attacked. The area was known for mountain lions, and encounters were not uncommon. I always carried a knife and a sidearm, but the sheer volume and despair in that cry stirred something more urgent in me than any animal threat I had known. I burst into the clearing, looking around frantically, my heart pounding. At first I saw nothing, but then I heard a sharp shout, feminine, desperate, and then a choking sound that made my stomach turn. Rounding the large cottonwood, I saw her. A young woman thrashing wildly was suspended by a rope tied to a branch overhead. My instincts took over. I threw my pack to the ground, ran toward her, and tried to get under her to support her weight. She was panicked, flailing, and inadvertently struck me more than once. I hugged her tightly to try and steady her movements, and then reached for my knife, sawing frantically at the rope just above the knot. When the rope gave way, she fell hard to the ground. I hadn't braced properly, and she slipped, hitting the dirt with a painful thud and a faint cut around her neck. I knelt beside her, searching for signs of life, gently trying to speak to her to see if she could respond. Her breathing was shallow, her expression locked in a faraway place of grief and shame. Tears ran down her cheeks, and yet she said nothing. There was no cell service out here, no way to call for help. I lifted her into a fireman's carry and made the long, anxious trek back toward my truck, pushing through brush and shadows with adrenaline surging through my veins. It was nearly dark by the time I got her into my back seat. I locked the child locks, got behind the wheel, and drove as fast as I could toward the nearest hospital. Through the rear-view mirror, she sat quiet, dazed, like a broken shell of someone who had endured more than I could comprehend. At the ER, I carried her inside, explaining hurriedly to the staff that she had choked herself accidentally during an exercise accident in our apartment gym. It was a foolish lie, but I panicked, not knowing what to say. I only wanted her to be safe and tended to. The hospital staff took her back immediately, and soon after, 2 police officers arrived. One questioned me gently but firmly, sensing something wasn't quite right. I told the truth this time, about the trail, the green truck, the hanging, and how I got her there. Eventually, one of the officers returned to inform me that she had corroborated my story. Before I left, I was allowed to see her. She still didn't speak, but I talked to her anyway, about how life can break us, but doesn't have to end us, about how people care even when it feels like no one does. I left my name and number with a note, then walked out into the night, heavy with thought. 2 weeks passed. Then one day, I received a call from an unfamiliar international number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened later, it was her, She thanked me for saving her life. She said she had been a 17-year-old exchange student, and the night before I found her, she had been assaulted at a party by classmates. Afraid of bringing shame to her family, she had tried to take her life in those woods. After a week in the hospital, she was sent back to Japan. In her message, she sounded composed but deeply emotional. She left her number and asked me to call her. That night, I did. We spoke for hours. She told me about her home, her hopes, her gratitude. Eventually, she asked for my mailing address to send a gift. Against my better judgment, I gave it to her. And then the packages began to arrive. Every week she sent something: candies, handwritten letters, hand-folded origami, even perfume. She would call often, and though it was overwhelming, I tried to be kind. But when she said she was returning to the US to finish out her school year, my stomach turned. Upon her arrival, she insisted we meet for dinner. I agreed, thinking it would be one final act of closure. But it didn't stop there. Every day she texted, asking where I was, what I was doing, what she could buy for me. If I didn't respond, she'd send a flood of texts spaced minutes apart. Then came the declarations that we were destined to be together, that fate had aligned our meeting, that she would make a perfect wife and mother for our future children. She was no longer just thankful, she was obsessed. I tried to let her down gently at first, telling her we needed space and that I appreciated her gratitude but didn't want anything more. She didn't take it well. Eventually I told her firmly to never contact me again. A week later, I woke up groggy from the strong sleeping pills I take for my PTSD. I sensed something was off. When I turned over, I saw her lying beside me in my bed. My heart stopped. She smiled and said softly, "See, my love? You didn't even know I was here. I can comfort you through the nightmares." I exploded with fury, demanding to know how she got in. She confessed she came in through the sliding glass door I often left unlocked. I told her to leave and never come back, and for a while, she didn't. The rest of the school year passed without incident. Summer came. I changed my phone number. I finally began to relax, assuming she'd gone back to Japan. But in August, a knock came at my door. It was her. She stood smiling, telling me she'd been accepted to a nearby college to stay close to me. Before she could say another word, I snapped. I told her I didn't care about her, that she meant nothing to me, that I wished she had died that night. Her face crumpled. She ran, crying back to her old green truck. Feeling a pang of guilt, I left the house a few minutes later to get food. But just down the road, traffic had backed up. There had been an accident. A familiar green truck had rolled off the road into a ditch. At the hospital, I waited for hours. When they finally let me in, she lay in a hospital bed, broken, battered, crying. Before I could say anything, she apologized again and again. Through all the anger, confusion and pain, we talked. Somehow the wall broke. We agreed to start over, not as lovers or even friends, but as two people trying to understand what the hell had happened. Over time, conversations resumed. Weeks became months, and somehow, against all odds, we fell into a rhythm. We got married in 2015 and had our first child that same year. Today we're still together. She jokes that fate did its job, that she always knew we belonged to each other. And maybe she was right. Through everything, madness, obsession, trauma, I still love her, with everything I have. Story 2. The gas station with the curtain. My father and his wife were on a long road trip, driving through the vast, barren stretches of Utah's countryside when they decided to stop for fuel and a short break. The desert air was dry and the sun hung low as dusk slowly crept in, casting long shadows across the empty highway. They pulled into a remote gas station that looked frozen in time, a faded sign, sun-bleached walls, and a lot that seemed too quiet for comfort. A single police car was parked off to the side of the lot, which gave my dad a slight sense of reassurance. The place looked abandoned apart from a man behind the register who appeared alert but oddly uneasy. My father walked inside while his wife followed closely behind, expecting nothing more than to grab a snack and use the restroom. As he stepped into the building, something about the man behind the counter caught his attention. He wasn't just standing idly like a typical cashier. Instead, he had one ear pressed to a police radio resting just below the counter, listening intently. My dad noticed how the man's hands fidgeted and how his eyes darted around the store, landing only briefly on the customers. Trying not to overthink it, he asked the man if he needed a key to use the bathroom. The man hesitated, his face twitching for just a moment before he quickly said no, and that the door should already be unlocked. Something about the exchange seemed off. The man's nervous energy lingered in the air, like static. But still, my dad pushed forward toward the restroom. Just before entering the bathroom, he noticed something to the side. A curtain hung in front of a narrow doorway, right beside the restroom entrance. It wasn't unusual for older buildings to have back areas closed off with curtains, but something about it made him pause. Peeking beneath the bottom edge of the curtain, he saw feet, men's feet, positioned unnaturally still and clad in polished black shoes that immediately struck a memory. They looked just like the shoes worn by the police officers in the parked cruiser outside. That realization hit my dad like a jolt of electricity, and he froze in place, pulse racing, every hair on his body standing on end. Something inside told him not to panic, not to make a scene, and definitely not to alert the man at the counter that he had seen something he wasn't supposed to see. Instead of using the bathroom, he calmly stepped away, walked back over to his wife and leaned in close to whisper, "Hey babe, let's get going. Mark's waiting for us." His voice was low and steady, but behind his eyes was a storm of thoughts. There was no Mark. That lie was a calculated attempt to signal to the man at the counter that someone was expecting them, that they were not alone in the world. His wife blinked in confusion for a moment, but then saw the seriousness in his eyes and didn't question him. They paid for their fuel with quiet civility and returned to their vehicle, not daring to look back at the man who now stood eerily still behind the glass. As they pulled away, my dad couldn't shake the feeling that they had narrowly escaped something sinister. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, waiting to see if the man would follow or if anyone else would step outside. But the gas station grew smaller and smaller behind them, swallowed up by the empty road and the encroaching darkness. When they were far enough away, my father finally told his wife what he had seen. The shoes, the curtain, the expression on the cashier's face. They sat in silence, letting the implications sink in. Had they walked in on a crime scene? Had a police officer been attacked and hidden there, waiting for discovery that might never come? Later, when I asked my dad why he didn't call the authorities right away, his answer was simple yet chilling. Because he was listening to a police scanner. If I had tried to call, he would have heard the dispatcher. He would have known. And we had a huge trailer. We weren't hard to follow. I wasn't going to risk it. His logic made sense. The man had likely staged the scene to appear normal for anyone who happened to pull in. But my father, sharp as ever, saw through it. There was no telling what might have happened if he had acted differently, if he had called the cops on the spot, if he had shown visible concern, or if he had let his wife go to the bathroom alone. That gas station remains burned into his memory, an anomaly in a wide stretch of forgettable road, a place that continues to haunt his thoughts years later. He never found out what really happened there, whether a crime was reported or a missing officer case surfaced in that area. The details remain hidden in the silence of that building, cloaked in mystery behind that curtain. It's possible that someone eventually discovered what was behind it, or perhaps the body was moved, the evidence destroyed, and the cashier vanished without a trace, disappearing into the same forgotten dust from which he appeared. My dad has no way of knowing, and part of him doesn't want to. Over time, that night became more than just a scary travel story. It became a lesson, a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it lurks behind everyday masks, waiting patiently. My father taught me to listen to my instincts, even when things seem normal on the surface, especially then, because it's the quiet places, the ones that feel off just enough to make your stomach turn, where the most terrifying truths often lie hidden. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't to confront or investigate, but to walk away, silently, swiftly, and alive. Years have gone by since that strange and unsettling night, but my dad still won't stop at lone gas stations. He prefers the well-lit chains with security cameras and several cars in the lot. If he ever finds himself too far off the grid, he'll just drive on until he hits a town, no matter how long it takes. His wife understands and doesn't question it anymore. Some stories never get answers. They live in the folds of our memory, their endings unfinished, their meanings unresolved. But the fear they leave behind feels just as real and enduring as the day they first took root. And as for me, I've never been to Utah, but whenever I pass a desolate stretch of highway or see a gas station standing alone with a flickering sign and no cars in sight, I think of that story, of my father's careful eyes, his quiet wisdom, and his decision not to play the hero. I wonder how many others have walked into places they shouldn't have, never to walk out. And I wonder how many curtains have hidden things far more terrifying than we'll ever know. Story 3. The Man Beneath the Gum Tree. It was a quiet Monday afternoon in Australia, and I was just 14 years old when something happened that still haunts me to this day. Band practice had run late, stretching into the evening, and by the time I stepped outside the school gates, the sun had dipped low, casting long golden shadows across the large open oval that separated the school from the train station. The oval was bordered by tall gum trees, and although there was a paved walkway around it, students almost always took the shortcut directly across the field. I'd done it countless times with friends, laughing and chatting as we carried our instruments and bags. But that day, everyone else had already gone home. For the first time, I was alone as I crossed the oval, my clarinet in one hand and a heavy backpack slung over my shoulder, completely unaware that this shortcut would become the scene of a memory I could never forget. As I reached the midpoint of the field, something broke the silence. A voice behind me, soft yet firm, male, but not hostile. "Excuse me, could you help me?" I turned automatically, thinking someone might be lost or looking for directions. What I saw stopped me cold. Lying just beneath one of the gum trees on the edge of the oval was a man in his 30s, partially hidden in the shade. His clothes were disheveled, his hair wild, and he had a yellow striped tennis bag lying beside him in the grass. But what caught my attention most wasn't his appearance, it was his hands. He was gripping something fleshy and pale, and it didn't take me more than a second to realize what he was doing. My blood turned to ice as his eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. A sick, leering smile, as if he was proud of what I had just seen. He didn't move from his spot, didn't lurch toward me or shout. Instead, he simply motioned with his eyes toward his own actions, as if to say, "Look closer." I felt the panic surge up in me like a wave, but I told myself to remain calm. I turned away without responding, clenched my fists to stop them from shaking, and walked forward, briskly but not running, telling myself over and over not to show fear, not to let him know how terrified I was. Every step felt like walking through water, slow and heavy, as my ears strained to hear whether he was following. Instead of footsteps, I heard his voice again. "Hey, excuse me." This time it was louder, more persistent, but I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. I reached the train station platform and was overwhelmed with relief to see other people waiting. I was no longer alone, but I was still shaken, still on high alert. My train approached slowly, its lights cutting through the late-day haze, and I climbed aboard, clutching my clarinet and backpack like life rafts. As the train pulled away, I glanced out the window and saw him again. The same yellow striped bag was slung over his shoulder now, and he was strolling lazily toward the station. Didn't rush, didn't run. It was as if this had been nothing but a routine for him, a game he had played before and would likely play again. Couldn't look away until he was out of sight. and only then did I feel the breath I'd been holding escape from my chest. I called my mum as soon as I could, voice shaking, and told her something had happened, that I didn't feel safe and she needed to pick me up. When I saw her car and climbed in, I broke down. I told her everything. The man, the way he looked at me, what he was doing beneath the tree. She drove straight to the police station where I gave her full statement. It was humiliating and exhausting to repeat the story over and over, especially at 14, but I knew it was important. The officers listened and reassured me that they would look into it. For a few days I was filled with nervous hope that they would find him, arrest him, stop him from ever doing something like that again. But weeks passed, and when the police finally called back, their answer was disheartening. They hadn't found him. The man had disappeared. No other reports had come in, and without a name, without a photo, there was little they could do. I understood, but it didn't make me feel any safer. From that day on, I never walked across the oval alone again. If I stayed late for band practice, I waited for my mum to pick me up, or I walked the long way around with a group of friends. I couldn't trust that shortcut anymore. It had been stained by something I couldn't unsee, couldn't unfeel, and I began to realize just how easily something horrifying can happen in a place you once thought was safe. What frightened me even more, looking back, wasn't just the man himself, but how calculated it all seemed. He had positioned himself just out of sight beneath the trees, waiting for someone to pass by. The bag, the voice, the disarming request. It was all designed to lure someone close, and it chilled me to the bone to think that he had chosen a spot right next to a school. That day, I had been lucky. I had turned away. I had gotten help. But I couldn't help but wonder if there had been others who weren't so fortunate. Children who had gone missing, or who had been too scared to speak. Years have gone by, but every now and then, especially when I walk past a field, or hear the rustle of gum trees in the wind, that memory returns, like a shadow brushing against my thoughts. I wonder where that man is now. Is he still out there, choosing another tree near another school? Or was he caught somewhere down the line, exposed for what he really was? I don't know. And maybe I never will, but I carry that moment with me, etched into the corners of my mind like a warning written in whispers. It taught me to listen to my instincts, to never doubt that feeling in your gut that tells you something is wrong. It also taught me about how quickly childhood can be interrupted by things you never should have to witness. There's no guidebook for what to do when something like that happens. You just survive it. You take a deep breath, put one foot in front of the other, and try to make it home. And sometimes you never fully come back from it, but you learn how to live with the memory, quiet as it may become. Now, as an adult, I sometimes pass schools and see kids walking across ovals just like I did, carefree and unaware. And I hope they never meet the man behind the tree. I hope they never have to feel the fear that I did. But I also hope they know, and if something ever does feel wrong, they don't need to be polite. They don't need to wait or doubt. They need to get away and find safety, because the world isn't always kind, and danger doesn't always come screaming. It sometimes waits quietly in the shade, with a smile. Story 4. The role play that turned into a nightmare. When I was 15, I stumbled into something I never imagined would spiral out of control. It began innocently enough, just a lonely teenager exploring the corners of the internet during a summer when my world felt especially small. My friends had drifted away, depression had taken hold, and I was searching for something to fill the hours and soothe the quiet ache in my chest. That's when I found the Amino app and joined a community centered around the show Riverdale. It seemed harmless at first, a place to chat, share fan art and engage in harmless roleplay. I met a lot of people there, some of whom were kind and supportive, but buried in that digital crowd was one person who would leave a lasting mark on me. Someone I knew only by the account name Cheryl. Cheryl and I started out as friends. We talked often, bonding over our favourite episodes and characters, and for a while I felt like I had found someone who genuinely understood me. He was funny, insightful, and always seemed to be online when I needed someone to talk to. I'm a lesbian, something I had only recently come to terms with, and I felt safe enough to tell him that early on. He said he understood, but then confessed that he had developed feelings for me. I apologized, telling him I simply wasn't into guys, and I meant it kindly. But after that, everything began to change. Cheryl started pulling away, and when I tried to reconnect, I found myself met with coldness, and then an eerie silence that soon gave way to something worse. Before I knew it, he was spamming me with messages across every platform he could find. Amino, Discord, Instagram, even Snapchat. No matter where I went, he followed. At first, it was relentless, but vague, just desperate attempts to reconnect. But the more I ignored him, the darker the messages became. When I finally gathered the courage to ask him to stop, he apologized profusely, only to rope me back into another cycle. We began role-playing again briefly, and I hoped we could maintain a safe distance. But that illusion quickly shattered when he told me he was now identifying as transgender. He said that since he was now presenting as female, we could be together after all, because I was a lesbian, and he, in his words, was now a girl. I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't about labels, it was about trust, and his behavior had become controlling, manipulative, and emotionally suffocating. I told him that I still didn't want to be with him, not after everything he had put me through. That's when the anger started. He called me names, terrible, hurtful things that dug deep into my insecurities. He said I was worthless, that no one would ever love me, and even reported me on Amino for reasons that made no sense. His cruelty stunned me. I felt trapped by my own desire not to hurt someone's feelings, and by his refusal to respect my boundaries. I reached out to a moderator on the app, explaining what was happening, and they suspended his account temporarily. I blocked him across every platform, but even with him out of sight, the fear lingered. I would check my inboxes constantly, heart racing with every notification. Occasionally, anonymous messages would appear, cryptic, familiar, chilling. I suspected they were from him, though I could never be sure. The truth was I no longer felt safe in a space that had once been a refuge. My world shrank again. I stopped role-playing, pulled away from online communities, and even started avoiding people in real life. The damage had been done. My self-esteem was fractured, and a part of me questioned whether I had somehow invited this simply by being friendly. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. What had happened wasn't my fault. It was the result of someone refusing to take no for an answer and twisting my kindness into something possessive. I never responded to his last messages. Over time, they became less frequent until they stopped altogether, but the emotional scars remained. For months after, I questioned everything: my sense of judgment, my identity, my trust in others. It made me afraid to connect with new people. I'd see a friendly message and immediately wonder what hidden intentions might be behind it. It was exhausting living in a state of constant vigilance, feeling like I had to protect myself not just from strangers, but from people who claimed to care. I started seeing a counselor eventually, and it helped. Slowly, I learned to reclaim some of the confidence I'd lost. Looking back, I see now that what happened to me was a form of grooming, manipulation, and emotional abuse. It may not have happened in the physical world, but it was real, and it hurt deeply. The internet gives people many masks to hide behind, and sometimes those masks are used to charm and disarm before the true face beneath reveals itself. I've come to understand that predators don't always start with threats. They start with affection, validation, and friendship. That's what makes them so dangerous. They make you feel special before making you feel small. They make you question yourself before you even realize you're in danger. I don't share this story because I want sympathy. I share it because I know there are others out there, young, isolated, seeking connection, who may be walking the same path I did, and I want them to know that they're not alone. That it's okay to say no, to walk away, to block someone, even if it feels harsh. Your safety matters more than someone else's feelings. Being kind should never be a vulnerability, but predators often take advantage of that kindness. Trust your instincts. If someone makes you feel uncomfortable, you don't owe them anything. Not your time, not your friendship, not your explanations. Now, years later, I've found safer spaces online, surrounded myself with people who respect my boundaries, and learned to enjoy role-playing again on my terms. I'm still a little guarded, and maybe I always will be, but I no longer live in fear of every message or notification. I've grown stronger, more discerning, and more confident in my right to protect my peace. What once was a nightmare has become a lesson, and while I wish it had never happened, I now know that surviving it made me braver than I ever thought I could be. Story 5. The Voice in the Lake. It was during a cool autumn week when my family rented a lakeside cabin for a week-long vacation, tucked away deep in the woods where the air felt cleaner and the silence stretched thick. I must have been around 12 years old at the time, and it was one of those crisp evenings where the trees rustled with dry leaves and the sky slowly dimmed to a dull purple. My older sister and I had spent the entire day outside with our younger brother, running through the trees, collecting rocks by the water, and getting just dirty enough to be told we couldn't track our muddy shoes into the cabin. As dusk began to settle, our parents decided to make a trip to the nearest grocery store. My sister and I stayed behind, tired from the day's adventure, and were told to stay inside and avoid the lake. The rule was simple: no swimming or wandering close to the water, especially when no adults were around. It was a rule we had heard 1,000 times. After they left with our brother, my sister settled down on the couch and dozed off. I stayed up, sipping juice and flipping through a magazine, until I realized I needed to use the toilet. The only problem was that the toilet wasn't in the main cabin. It was housed in a separate outhouse, a short walk away, closer to the lake. The evening had grown darker and mistier than I expected, and though I was a fan of spooky stories and ghost tales, walking through that fog toward the lake alone gave me pause. Still, I told myself not to be silly. I zipped up my jacket, slid on my shoes, and made my way across the damp grass. The trees loomed tall and quiet, and every crunch beneath my feet sounded unnaturally loud. Halfway there, a sharp crack echoed through the woods, as if a branch had been snapped in half by something heavy. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sound had come from behind the outhouse, too close to ignore. I strained my ears, but the woods had gone still again. No movement, no breeze, just silence. I convinced myself it must have been a deer or something harmless, and quickly ducked inside the outhouse. My heart was thudding faster now, and I felt uneasy but tried not to let my imagination take over. Through the small window of the outhouse, I peeked outside again, and what I heard next made my stomach twist with dread. More rustling, louder this time. Then, without warning, a loud splash. Something had entered the lake. Without stopping to think, I flung the door open and ran, glancing behind me only once to see nothing but ripples on the water. I sprinted toward the cabin, and just as I reached the steps, a familiar voice called out, "Hey, sweetie, come here for a second." It was my father's voice, unmistakable and clear as day, but when I turned toward the driveway, I saw no car. My breath turned icy. Our car was gone. My parents hadn't returned yet. Confused and now trembling, I slowly turned toward the lake, and what I saw nearly made my knees give out. There, standing waist-deep in the middle of the dark water, was a man who looked exactly like my dad. Same shirt, same hair, same posture. He stood perfectly still, smiling, calling my name again and again, with a voice too flat, too rehearsed. I watched in horror as he repeated the same line like a broken record. "Come here, come here, come here." His mouth moved, but his body never shifted, not even the surface of the water around him. It was like he was frozen in place, anchored to nothing, floating in a way no human should. The water beneath him didn't ripple. His smile didn't change, and suddenly I realized with absolute clarity, this was not my father. I turned and ran inside the cabin, locking the doors behind me, heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I collapsed to the floor beside the window, pulling the curtains closed and crouching low as I tried to steady my breath. My sister stirred from the couch, half asleep, and I barely managed to whisper that something was outside. She rubbed her eyes, confused, while I sat frozen in fear. It felt like hours before I heard the sound of tires on gravel. My heart jumped. I peeked out the window and saw headlights breaking through the fog. It was my family. My real father, my mother, and my little brother stepping out of the car, laughing about something trivial. I ran to the door, threw it open, and ran straight into my dad's arms, sobbing. He was taken aback, concerned, but he didn't understand. I couldn't explain it all at once. I just kept repeating that someone or something had been in the lake, pretending to be him. Later, when things had calmed down and I could talk again, I told him everything. He laughed nervously and said maybe it had just been a dream, or maybe I had seen a large fish and scared myself. But deep down, I knew what I saw. It wasn't a dream, and that wasn't a fish. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept watching the lake from the cabin window, half expecting to see that frozen smile again in the distance. But the water remained still, the forest quiet. The next day, I begged my parents not to leave us alone again. I avoided the outhouse, the trees, even the back porch. The place felt different now, like something had been disturbed. Even in daylight, the lake shimmered with an unnatural stillness. Couldn't go near it without that vision returning. My father's voice calling from a motionless mouth, his eyes locked on mine without blinking. The worst part wasn't the image itself. It was the feeling that whatever it was had wanted to lure me in. And I knew that if I had taken one more step toward the water, I might not have come back. Years passed. We never returned to that cabin. My family chalked it up to childhood imagination, a wild story they thought I had spun out of boredom or fear. But I never forgot. Even now, as an adult, I stay away from lakes at night. There's something about deep, dark water that holds secrets we aren't meant to understand. I've read about doppelgangers, about spirits that mimic the living to lure others to their doom. I don't know what I saw that night, but I know it wasn't human. And whatever it was, it knew my father's face, his voice, and my name. It waited in silence for me to get close, and it almost succeeded. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about that smile. I hear that same voice calling out from the dark, asking me to come closer. I always wake up before I reach the edge of the water, heart racing and drenched in sweat. Maybe it's a memory. Maybe it's a warning. All I know is that there are things out there we can't explain. And some of them wear the faces of those we trust most. But they are not who they appear to be. They are something else. Something that waits beneath the surface, quiet and patient. Story 6. The Stranger at the Door. It was a chilly morning in November of 2018 when something deeply unsettling happened to me. Something that has stayed with me every day since. My wife and I had a routine back then. She worked early shifts and I would drive her to work before returning home to get more rest. That morning followed the usual pattern. I dropped her off around 8:00 a.m. Then made the short drive back to our place and settled into bed, hoping to catch a few more hours of sleep before starting my own shift later that afternoon. I'd only just pulled the blankets over me when I heard a knock at the front door. It was steady, deliberate, and oddly persistent. At first I assumed it was a family member. Most of my in-laws lived close by, and sometimes they would stop over without notice, but something about the knock made me hesitate. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't casual either. It felt like someone who wasn't going to leave until I answered. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and shuffled to the door, still in my sleep clothes and rubbing the fatigue from my eyes. When I opened it, I was surprised to see a man I didn't recognize. He was about my height, maybe 5'8", thin, with sharp eyes that didn't seem quite focused. He looked jittery, his movements quick and unpredictable. "Did you come up to my house and take my girlfriend?" he asked abruptly, his voice almost accusing. I blinked, unsure I'd heard him correctly. I told him no, that I hadn't been to anyone's house. I had just taken my wife to work and come straight back home. He didn't seem convinced. He stared at me, squinting slightly, like he was trying to read something behind my eyes. Then, just as quickly as he'd accused me, he switched topics. "Aren't these boots nice?" he said suddenly, gesturing down at his shoes. The tone change was jarring, and it was then I realized he might be on something. Maybe drugs, maybe not in his right mind at all. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me at the door with an uneasy feeling creeping through me like smoke. I locked up and went back to bed, but sleep never came. About 15 minutes later, there was another knock. I peeked through the window. It was him again. He was holding something, what he called a gift he had left on my porch. It looked like a cheap makeup kit, the kind you'd buy for a young child, not something you'd give your adult girlfriend. I thanked him uneasily and shut the door again. This time I stayed near the window watching to see what he would do. He lingered near my brother-in-law's truck, staring directly at my house. His eyes were cold and empty, like he was staring through the walls. A slow chill crept over me. Something about his presence didn't sit right. I debated calling the police but hesitated, afraid it might escalate things. The next few hours passed in a haze. I kept replaying our interaction over and over, trying to make sense of it. Then, just as I stepped out of the shower, I heard another knock, this time harder, more aggressive, like a pounding demand rather than a polite request. My heart sank. I knew it was him again. Panicking, I tried to reach my brother-in-law, hoping he could come over. I hesitated to call the police again, but my gut screamed at me that this wasn't going to stop on its own. I opened the door, trying to stay calm. Sure enough, there he was. He didn't bother with pleasantries this time. He pointed at my car and asked whose it was. I told him it was mine. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. His face twisted with anger, and he began ranting about how his friends had seen his girlfriend get into my car that morning. His words were loud and aggressive, laced with threats and accusations. "Come out here and we'll settle this like men," he spat. "Only cowards hide in their house." I told him to leave, that I had no idea what he was talking about, but he kept yelling, his voice rising, his hands twitching at his sides. Something snapped inside me. I was tired, scared, and furious all at once. I told him to wait, then stormed out onto the porch with adrenaline burning through my veins. By the time I stepped outside, he had already backed off, shouting more insults from a distance. I told him to get off my property before I called the cops. That finally sent him running. As soon as he disappeared, I called 911 and explained everything. My sister-in-law came over to check on me, followed shortly by my brother-in-law. I was still shaking when the police arrived. Fortunately, my in-laws knew who the guy was. They gave the police his name, address, and even the make and model of the car he usually drove. It turned out the man lived just down the road. The officers left to find him, and when they couldn't locate him at first, they went directly to his house. He was walking back up the street when they approached him. I don't know what they said, but something they did worked. He didn't return that day. I stood by my window, watching, still on edge. A few hours later, while I was picking up a package from a relative, I saw him again, just standing in the road, staring at my house, like he was still trying to piece together some imagined connection. He never made another move toward me after that. According to my in-laws, the guy eventually apologized and said he'd been high on meth. Apparently, he and his friends had seen my wife getting into the car that morning and mistook her for his girlfriend, who shared a similar hair color. It didn't justify what he had done, but it gave context to the madness. Still, that didn't make me feel safer. It made me feel more vulnerable, knowing how easily a stranger could spiral into violence over a delusion. I've never had a more terrifying experience, and I can say with absolute certainty that I have never felt more threatened than I did that day. That's the reason I own a firearm now. Not because I want to use it, but because I never want to feel that defenseless again. Looking back, I realize how quickly things could have escalated if I had said the wrong thing, opened the door at the wrong moment, or if my wife had been home alone. It reminded me that danger doesn't always come with warning signs. Sometimes it shows up at your door, smiling one minute and snarling the next. Since that day, I've been more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and more willing to trust my instincts, because even though nothing came of it in the end, the memory of his eyes staring through my window still makes my skin crawl, and I know that if I had handled it differently, I might not be here to tell the story. Story 7, The Angry Spirit in the Rec Room. For as long as I can remember, the women in my family have had a strange sensitivity to the spiritual world. We aren't mediums, not in the way that people expect. No seances or crystal balls. But we feel things. My mother and I call it our spidey sense. A tingling in the back, a pressure on the temples, a sudden change in temperature or mood in a space that had just felt ordinary moments before. I'm a third-generation witch and a practicing paranormal investigator, though I often approach investigations from a scientific angle. My goal has always been to prove what I feel, to capture on video or audio the things that can't be explained. But even with all my experience, there was one incident that made me realize some spirits aren't subtle. Some don't just want to be noticed, they want to be felt, and they want you to know you're not welcome. It happened earlier this year when my grandmother was recovering from spinal surgery. She was placed in a convalescent home for a few weeks, a familiar place where she had stayed before after a previous surgery. I had visited her years ago in the same building and remembered getting a terrible feeling near the front hallway, like a heaviness that wrapped around you. As soon as you entered, I expected to feel that same unease when I walked in with my mum this time, but instead, the place seemed lighter, even cheerful. The staff had remodeled since our last visit. The rooms looked brighter, the paint fresher, and the lobby had been rearranged. A woman at the front desk overheard my comment about the missing Finch atrium, and she smiled, telling us it had been moved to the rec room at the back of the building. After a warm visit with my grandma that lasted about an hour and a half, my mum and I decided to go see the birds before leaving. We walked down a long hallway toward the rec room, which was tucked in the far end of the building where the men's rooms were. As we turned the corner, my body tensed. That familiar, unexplainable sensation began creeping in. A subtle, invisible presence brushing against my awareness. It wasn't overwhelming at first, just enough to make the hairs on my arms stand up. I didn't say anything to my mum right away, but I noticed her shoulders shift, her pace slow. I could tell she was feeling it too. We entered the rec room where two women, one elderly, one clearly visiting, were seated by the Finch enclosure. Two small poodles danced at their feet, occasionally barking at the birds. The air inside that room shifted almost instantly. At first it was subtle, a drop in temperature, a slight dimming of the energy, but within seconds it grew heavy, almost suffocating. My head started to ache with that familiar temple pressure, what we call head squeezies. My mum and I made eye contact, and without speaking, we turned to leave. But before we could reach the doorway, the sensation intensified. It slammed into both of us like a wall. The pressure in my head became unbearable, and my vision blurred slightly at the edges. I felt stoned, like my face was wearing a too tight mask. My mum clutched her back, saying she felt a push between her shoulder blades. It was as though something unseen had taken notice of us, had decided we didn't belong, and wanted us gone. We walked quickly down the hall, trying not to look panicked. But it wasn't just the physical sensations anymore. I could feel something deeper, more personal, an intense presence behind us, malevolent and angry. It felt like a man, strong and furious, like a storm following close behind. I stumbled, shoulder-checking the wall, barely keeping my balance. My mum reached for my arm, telling me to hold on until we got outside. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the tension in it. As soon as we burst through the doors and into the rose garden out front, the feeling didn't vanish. In fact, it clung to us like a fog. I grabbed the white picket fence for support, suddenly nauseous, my stomach turning in knots. The sun felt too far away, the air too thin. My mum turned to me and said, "I know you're hurting worse than me, but I cannot have this thing follow me home. Can you do something?" And I knew exactly what she meant. I closed my eyes, grounded myself, and began the verbal release I always use after an investigation. "Thank you, spirits, for communicating with us," I whispered, my hands trembling. "But we are leaving now. You are not permitted to follow us. You must remain here. You cannot cross this threshold." I said it with conviction, my voice firm despite the fear gnawing at me. My mum stood beside me, silently reinforcing the intention with her own energy. The atmosphere began to lift, slowly, like a fog thinning in the sun. We walked to the car and sat in silence for a moment before starting the engine. As my mum turned the key, I placed my hand on the dashboard and muttered an old spell. "Keeper of bones, I know thy face, but I may yet outstrip thy pace." It was a protection charm, something my mother had taught me years ago. By the time we pulled into her driveway, the worst of it had passed, but there was still a lingering tension in the air, a sense that the entity had tried to hitch a ride. At her front door, I whispered one final spell. "Who comes to me, I keep. Who goes from me, I free. But against all I stand, who carry not my key." As soon as we crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. Whatever had followed us had been left behind. Even now, I think about that spirit, the force behind that aggressive energy. He wasn't subtle. He didn't tap on walls or flicker lights. He didn't need to. He was presence and pressure and power. I didn't try to communicate with him, didn't want to know his name. He made it clear that we had seen too much, that we were not welcome, and he was willing to make us feel it. I've dealt with many hauntings over the years, some curious, some sad, some simply confused, but this was the first time I felt true rage coming from the other side. Not just annoyance, but fury. A soul trapped and furious at anyone who dared enter his space. I never went back to that facility, and I advised my mum not to either. We made sure my grandmother was well cared for from a distance, keeping our visits to her retirement community instead. The staff at the convalescent home never knew what we experienced, and maybe that's for the best. Maybe the spirit has his reasons. But whatever they are, I know one thing for sure. Some energies do not forget you, even after you've left their space. And some places, no matter how clean, how bright, how remodeled, still hold shadows too deep for paint or sunlight to erase. Story 8, The Wendigo on the Road. It was July 30th, 2008, when my buddy and I took a road trip to Manitoba. The goal was simple. We needed to pick up medicines for an upcoming sweat ceremony, something spiritual, something sacred. The drive had been long but peaceful, the kind of stillness that settles in when you're out in the prairies, far away from the noise of towns. We were west of Portage, La Prairie, when my friend pulled into a small gas station. He said he had to use the bathroom, and I stayed behind in the truck. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky with purples and oranges. I leaned my head back, dozing off, the soft hum of the engine and the fading daylight lulling me into a trance. That's when everything changed. Suddenly, I couldn't breathe. Ice-cold hands, bony and withered, wrapped tightly around my throat. The stench that accompanied them was unbearable, something worse than death, worse than rot. I'd been hunting all my life and smelt my fair share of decomposing animals in the woods, but this was different. It was ancient, angry and full of hunger. My body locked up in terror as my vision began to fade. Black spots danced in front of my eyes, and tears streamed down my face uncontrollably. I tried to twist, to move, to shake off whatever had climbed onto me, but I couldn't. My limbs didn't respond. It was like my body had become paralyzed beneath this invisible weight. And that's when I heard it. Bang, bang, bang. My buddy slamming on the truck window from outside. Through the glass, I saw him, wide-eyed and terrified, pounding with both fists and screaming something I couldn't make out at first. The noise in my ears was deafening, like a constant ringing, but I read his lips. He was shouting the word Wendigo. In that instant, memories came flooding back. I was a child again, hearing my father's warnings on cold winter nights. Get inside, boy, there are man-eaters in these woods. Back then, I thought it was just a story to keep me from wandering off after dark. He told me the Wendigo were spirits that haunted the starving and the broken, that they craved human flesh and preyed on the weak, the desperate, the greedy. If you were pure of heart, he said, all you had to do was blow a breath at them and they'd vanish. But if you weren't, they would possess you and turn you into one of them. That memory sparked something inside me. With the last ounce of strength I had, I turned my head slightly and exhaled toward the creature. A short, trembling breath, but it was all I could manage. And then, silence. The smell vanished. The pressure lifted. The cold disappeared. I gasped, collapsing into my seat like I'd just escaped drowning. My buddy threw open the passenger door, grabbed my arm and pulled me out. We didn't speak. We just stood there, breathing heavily, staring at each other in mutual disbelief. We got back in the truck and drove in silence, each of us lost in thought, shaken to our core. The sun had long since set, and the road ahead looked darker than usual. But even 10 minutes down the highway, traffic came to a halt. We were in the middle of nowhere, so seeing a backup was strange. As we inched forward, red and blue lights flickered across our windshield. A Greyhound bus had pulled off the road, surrounded by cruisers and emergency vehicles. Passengers stood nearby, pale and shaken, many of them staring into space with glassy eyes. We didn't stop. My buddy cursed under his breath and turned the truck around, heading back toward a run-down motel we had passed earlier. Something about the scene didn't sit right. It wasn't until we checked into the motel and turned on the old crackling television that we learned the truth. The news report was grim. One adult male confirmed deceased in what is being called a frenzied knife attack, the anchorwoman said, her voice trembling. There are reports that the suspect consumed parts of the victim's body. My blood went cold. The victim's name was Tim McLean, and the suspect Vince Lee had reportedly claimed that God had told him to kill. Tim had been asleep on the bus when he was attacked, stabbed over 60 times, decapitated and partially cannibalized. The brutality of it stunned the nation. The horror of it was hard to comprehend. My buddy and I exchanged looks, both pale as ghosts. I guess the Wendigo needed to be fed, he said softly. Not as a joke, but as a quiet, horrible realization. It wasn't just a coincidence, we both knew that. Something had been lurking in that region, something old, something primal. I had felt it, choking me in that truck, testing me, tasting me. Maybe I had escaped. Maybe it chose someone else instead. Or maybe, just maybe, it was never about choice. Maybe it was just hunger. The Wendigo wasn't a myth, not to us. It was real. It had a face now, a crime scene, a name, a trail of blood and headline, and somewhere in the deep woods and dark places of this world, it still prowls, still watches, still waits for those who are alone, broken, vulnerable. The news said Vince was a paranoid schizophrenic, that he was released years later under a new name with no criminal record. But that explanation felt hollow. In our culture, we believe that spirits can find their way into people, that darkness doesn't always need an invitation, that if you are empty enough inside, something else can step in. I don't know what Vince Lee saw that night. I don't know if he felt the same hands I did, but I do know this. I was nearly taken, and something far more tragic happened in my place. The Wendigo fed, and I've never felt entirely safe since. The memory lingers like frostbites beneath the skin, aching in the quiet hours before dawn. Even now, I hesitate before driving through remote stretches of wilderness. I don't sleep easily in parked cars, and when I feel that cold, crawling sensation at the back of my neck, I remember how close I came. I remember the smell, the hands, the look in my friend's eyes when he pounded on the glass, and I wonder who else the Wendigo will visit, because it doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not. When it finds you, belief becomes irrelevant. The only thing that matters is what kind of breath you have to offer, clean or corrupted. Story 9. The Man in the Fog. There was a time in my life when I worked security at a large industrial complex on the edge of town. The kind of facility that always felt isolated, no matter how close the nearest highway was. I worked the graveyard shift from midnight to 8 o'clock a.m., and the solitude suited me just fine. Most nights were uneventful, checking cameras, walking empty corridors, logging hourly rounds. But one night, everything changed, and I've never looked at fog the same way again. It was a late autumn evening, and a thick mist had rolled in from the nearby river, coating the facility in a veil of cold, damp greyness. By 3 a.m. visibility was down to almost nothing, and the silence outside was absolute, the kind that presses against your eardrums like cotton. I was in the control room sipping lukewarm coffee and flipping through the site logs when the motion detector at the south gate tripped. The monitor lit up with static for a second before stabilizing, showing nothing but fog. I thought it might have been an animal, a raccoon maybe, but protocol demanded a manual check. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped my coat up to my chin, and stepped outside. The air was freezing and still. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on gravel. As I walked toward the gate, the beam of my flashlight cut through the mist like a sword, but it didn't reveal much. Just the usual fence line, an empty road beyond. But then, about 30 feet ahead, something moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate. A figure stepped forward from the fog. My breath caught in my throat. He was tall, unusually thin, with his hands hanging motionless at his sides. He wore a dark trench coat that hung like dead weight from his shoulders, and even though I couldn't make out his face clearly, I felt his eyes locked on me. I raised my flashlight, aimed it directly at him and shouted, "This is private property. Identify yourself." No response, no movement, just silence. My fingers twitched against the baton at my hip. I didn't want to draw it unless I had to, but every instinct in me was screaming that this man wasn't just a trespasser, he was something else entirely. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. That's when I noticed something was off. His feet weren't quite touching the ground. He seemed to hover just slightly, like the mist had thickened around him, holding him up. I blinked, thinking it might be a trick of the light. When I opened my eyes again, he had moved. Not walked, just shifted closer, like the distance between us had collapsed without him taking a single step. My heart started to pound in my chest. I backed up slowly, trying not to turn my back to him. I radioed into dispatch, but all I got was static. Every channel was dead. My phone had no signal. I was alone, and he was getting closer. The fog wrapped around us like a curtain. I could barely see the control room anymore. I turned back toward the gate, and he was gone. The space where he had stood was now empty. I scanned left and right, flashlight beam cutting through the mist like a whisper. That's when I heard it, a deep, gravelly breath, inches from my ear. I spun around. Nothing, just empty air, but I knew without a doubt that he was there. I felt the weight of his presence pressing against my spine. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the damp pavement as I rushed back toward the building. The fog seemed to part for me, only to close behind me like a trap. When I finally slammed the door behind me and locked it, I stood there heaving, heart racing, trying to convince myself I was still alone. I checked the monitors again. The cameras were all fuzzy, distorted by static. One screen flickered, and for just a moment I saw the man again, standing at the edge of the south fence, staring directly into the lens, and then he vanished. I reported the incident in my log but didn't call it in. What would I say? That a ghost walked out of the fog and stared me down? That he floated off the ground and whispered into my ear without a mouth? I knew I'd be laughed out of the job, if not worse. The next few nights passed without incident, but I never left the building again during my shift. I watched the fog through the windows, always half expecting him to return. A week later, another guard took my shift. He was a new guy, young, skeptical, full of bravado. He laughed when I told him about the fog, and the man said I'd been breathing in too much coffee steam. But that same night, around 3:00 a.m., he quit, left a note on the desk that said, "I saw him too," and never came back. The company chalked it up to nerves. I didn't argue. Years later, I still dream about that fog, about the man standing silently in the mist, watching. I don't think he was a ghost in the traditional sense. I think he was something older, something that walks the edge of this world and the next, looking for cracks in the fabric of reality. And when the mist rolls in thick enough, he steps through. He doesn't knock, he doesn't speak, he just watches, waiting for you to see him, waiting to be remembered. Sometimes I think he wasn't just warning me, but marking me, and I wonder, when the fog returns, thick enough, if he'll come back for what he left behind. So now, when the weather turns, and the mist starts to gather low along the streets, I lock my windows, I draw the blinds, I don't go outside, I don't answer the knock, no matter how polite it sounds, because I've learned that there are things in the fog that don't belong to this world, and once you see them, they see you. Once they find you, they don't forget, and sometimes they wait. Story 10, The Boy Who Knew Too Much. When I first started working at a daycare center in a quiet rural town, I expected the usual routine: games, snack time, and scraped knees. It was a sweet, simple job in a community where everyone knew each other. The center was cozy, tucked inside a refurbished church building with colorful walls and cheerful posters. The kids were usually bubbly and energetic, their laughter echoing through the halls. But there was one boy, Timmy, who stood apart. He was 5 years old, bright for his age, polite to the point of being eerie, and always watching with wide, thoughtful eyes. He didn't speak often, but when he did, he chose his words carefully, like each sentence had weight behind it. I didn't realize how different he was until the day he asked if I believed in past lives. It was a rainy afternoon, and the kids were painting at the long table by the window. Timmy sat quietly, painting a series of small dark figures on a hill under a red sky. I crouched beside him and asked what it was. Without looking up, he replied, "It's where I died last time." I blinked, caught off guard. I asked him what he meant. He looked me square in the eye, his expression blank. "I was a soldier. I was 22. We got hit with something. I woke up again in this small body. My name was Paul before." I gave a polite chuckle, assuming he was mimicking something he saw on TV. But he didn't smile. "You don't believe me," he said. "That's okay. Nobody does. But I still remember the fire and the screaming. It's loud before you come back." The way he said it made my skin crawl. The other kids carried on playing, unaware, but I sat there for a long moment, watching him paint that desolate landscape. Over the next few weeks, Timmy would occasionally drop more strange comments, quietly, casually, as if they were normal things to say. He talked about people he used to know, about dying in cold mud, about running from loud machines that spat fire. He'd say he missed someone named Clara, who he claimed was his wife in the last life. Every time he spoke like this, it was like he transformed. His voice got deeper, slower. There was a heaviness to him that didn't match the small frame of a kindergartner. I began to keep a journal of what he said. The details were too consistent, too vivid, too specific to be imagined by a 5-year-old. Then one day he told me something that still haunts me. We were sitting on the floor playing with blocks when he leaned close and said, "You used to be my friend in the other life. You had a beard then. You died with me." I froze. I asked what he meant, and he said, "I saw you in the mud beside me. You were yelling something." Then it went quiet. I had never served in the military, never even known anyone who had passed away in war, but the sincerity in his eyes, the conviction in his voice, it shook something loose in me. I started having strange dreams after that. Dreams of muddy trenches, of thunderous booms overhead, of choking smoke and the sharp snap of distant rifles. I thought maybe I was letting his stories get to me, but then I did something I never should have done. I looked up the name he'd given me, Paul, a 22-year-old soldier who died in Europe. I found a match, Private Paul McLaren, killed in World War I. His photo was grainy and faded, but the resemblance to Timmy was there, in the eyes, in the mouth. It felt like falling into a cold pool. I checked military records. I found another man listed beside Paul, his unit mate, a corporal who died the same day. That man's name was Thomas Crane. My name is Tom Crane, my grandfather's name, and mine. I had always assumed it was a coincidence, familial recycling of names, but something about that connection felt deeper now. The next time I saw Timmy, he gave me a long look and said, "I'm glad you're back. I don't feel as scared when you're near." I wanted to ask him so many things. What he remembered, why he remembered, what it meant. But part of me didn't want to know. Some doors shouldn't be opened. Some truths can't be unlearned. I started avoiding long conversations with him after that. I couldn't sleep well, and the dreams became more vivid, more like memories than fantasies. I saw Timmy in the dreams too, not as a boy but as a soldier, standing beside me in that lifeless, smoke-filled place. Eventually, Timmy's family moved away. His father got a new job in a neighbouring state, and just like that, he was gone. No goodbyes, no final messages, just an empty chair at the table and a silence that settled heavy over the daycare. I never saw him again, but I still think of him often. I wonder if he still remembers, if he's told new people the same stories, if he's found anyone else from his other life. Sometimes I catch glimpses of kids who remind me of him, too serious, too knowing, with old eyes that don't match their age. I wonder how many like him walk among us, trapped in cycles they can't explain. Maybe Timmy really was Paul. Maybe I really was Thomas. Maybe reincarnation is real, and some souls carry more with them than others. I don't have the answers. But I know this. Sometimes children say things they shouldn't know, paint scenes they've never seen, and speak truths they've never been taught. And when they do, you should listen. Because maybe, just maybe, they're not making it up. Maybe they're remembering.